All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this Enterprise and Utilities Oversight Committee to order at 11:06. Can we go ahead and call the roll, please?
Miss Allard,
She'll be joining us about noon.
Mr. Constant is here. Mr. Dunbar,
Here, or do I say Forrest or here?
whichever. You're fine. Whichever. Miss Kennedy, Miss LaFrance,
Here.
Mr. Peterson,
Present.
Mr. Perez-Verdia, Miss Quinn Davidson,
Here.
thank you, Mr. Rivera, Mr. Weddleton, and Miss Salatel.
Here.
You have a quorum.
And Mr. Constant is also here for the record. So, hello, everybody. Welcome. We have kind of a packed agenda, first time in a while. The items we have are the AWWU report on the permit reapplication process for Asplund, an update on the fire hydrant expenses, a discussion about port infrastructure grant, discussion about the Port of Alaska modernization project phase 2, discussion with David Ames from Jacobs. Any other items we want to add to that agenda? Hearing none, we're going to dive right in. Mr. Corsentino, you have the floor.
Okay, good morning. Two presentations today, as Chris alluded to. First one's on the wastewater side, which is our permit reapplication process for our Aspen wastewater treatment facility. So the first slide is going to be to show what we're going to talk about today. First is just a refresher on what the 301H permit is in Aspen overall. The last time I was here was January of 2021 when we gave kind of a educational update on what it was about. Then I'll talk about what we're here for is actually there's an item on the assembly that's up for approval. It's a must-pass item on April 26th. Actually, there's two items. We'll talk about both of those and summarize what's in those two items, explain the consequences of this permit loss, and just facilitate any questions. So to get started, as a brief history, let's go. Aspen's the largest wastewater plant in Alaska. It began operations in 72 as part of the Clean Water Act amendments. It was upgraded in 89 to facilitate growth, but we operated at a lower level because that growth never fully occurred. And the first permit was a primary treatment permit because that was allowed at that time. In 77, so the big thing about this permit is it's a primary permit. It's a waiver for BOD and TSS, which define really the concept of secondary treatment. And so it's whether or not you remember it, that was the key ingredient between what defines between primary and secondary. So 301H is the section that allows for a waiver of BOD and TSS, allowing a primary treatment facility to exist in select marine environments and only on a case-by-case basis. There's not that many of them left in the United States, about 50. And they all have to be ocean outfalls. Happens to be about 9 of them are in Alaska. EPA permitted our first, while we applied in 77, our first permit came into place in 85. And unfortunately, these are 5-year permits, but EPA takes a long time to re-administer them. So usually 15 to 20 years is not uncommon, and which has been the case for the last several times we've had this permit. We had it reauthorized in 2000. In 2005, we submitted it for a timely reapplication, but EPA has put us on an administrative extension for the last 22 years, or actually 17 years past 2005. Now, what's important though that these are, as we alluded to last time, these permits are intended to meet all compliance with the Clean Water Act. So they do treat wastewater. They're very good at doing that. We have an extensive marine monitoring program over 36 years, and with the link there showing you the results. And what we've shown is there's no adverse impact to the environment with our permit, and it's really the right choice for this environment and our discharge environment. But it is going to take it's a long process to get it reupdated because one of the things that's happened since then is the beluga whale impact, or the Beluga Whale Endangered Species Act, which complicates the reapplication process. And but what's occurring now is, and we alluded to what happened in 2021, is EPA is acting on all these permits in Alaska. They've told us they're going to pivot to us this fall, but we have to start the process now with DEC because one of the requirements is that DEC has to certify that we meet state water quality standards for other pollutants. So this next slide is what is the Clean Water Act and 301H. I think I've kind of talked about that already. This is just really a flyover because we've talked about that. There's 9 criteria. I've summarized them in 4 bullet points here. Essentially, the 9 meet to 4 major points. You have to meet primary treatment standards. You have to discharge an environment that does, and the discharge cannot degrade the waters that you discharge into, you have to continue to monitor to show that you're not degrading the environment, you're meeting standards, and you have to control your toxic pollutants because these permits are intended for domestic wastewater through industrial treatment program, which we have. And we've shown the results over decades that we've done all that and done it very, very well. Next slide just shows you kind of an overview of what primary treatment is. What's missing in here is the BOD and TSS removals through another process. Go ahead. Sure. Yeah. So what
I
I will.
also have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Do we have this slide deck up on the website?
Yes.
Okay. For members of the public who want to follow along, you can.
And I don't remember, Austin, if you're here. So I gave an exhaustive presentation in January that has more of this. So that's why I'm flying over this. So I apologize. It'll still slow down. But we did kind of the educational thing, which is a longer conversation with much more information. So hence, I'm just trying to give you a refresher. But nevertheless, I'll slow down. Primary treatment just has, it screens out the salt, trash, waste, all kinds of solids. We take that to the landfills, what this shows. We settle out all the solids, the biosolids, which are then incinerated. The clarified water at the top is then disinfected and discharged into Cook Inlet. That's at a high flyover. On secondary, you'd also have usually another activated sludge process, another settling process to get the BOD and TSS further polished. Ironically, we do, one of the slides that we showed last time that I don't have today is we almost meet secondary standards with TSS, our total suspended solids. And that's because we have a longer settling time in our clarifiers. And so we are almost at again, I don't have it in this presentation because it was more of a refresher. The definition for BOD and TSS for between primary and secondary is you have to have 85% removal of BOD and TSS. On secondary, primary, you only have to have 30%. As it turns out, we are at 80% removal of TSS in our primary treatment process. So we exceed the primary treatment standards very, very well, and BOD, quite frankly. So we are almost at secondary and TSS. BOD, we exceed 30% removal, or about 40 to 45%. So we have really good treatment. And these are probably terms you may not be. Fair enough. Okay. Well, there's a lot to, I apologize, and I'll continue to slow down. There's a lot to talk about. Here, I will certainly slow down because the next slide is what are we asking for? In order to renew this permit, there's a lot of work involved in it. And so what's specifically on the next assembly agenda, there's a contract with Jacobs that we went through the RFP process and to solicit permit integration services. And it's the permit integration services involves a lot of scope, which I'll go forth in the next slides, but I want to put this front and center, which is essentially we need to get this process started simply because we need to do field work this summer in the inlet. We have a meeting with EPA and DEC as a kickoff to this permit renewal process in mid-May. And so we need to get them under contract to start that process because they're part of the team and an integral part of the team. What you'll see in the assembly memorandum when it's finalized, it's going through the process right now, is that we're calling it 2 phases, really the whole assortment of services over the next 18 to 36 months. It's a long process. Is going to be, we're calling $1 million for the basic services simply because that's what we have right now once we get the first quarter budget revision approved. And then next year we'll have another $2.5 million. So we want to get the whole thing approved, $3.5 million, but we're only going to actually have $1 million funded through the first year.
We have this, I'm trying to take it all in.
Sure, no,
So we have this, oh, thank you, Forrest, this exemption, or what is it called?
It's a waiver for secondary.
A waiver. And so the money you're asking for is to prepare an application for a continuation of the waiver, essentially?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. And my understanding, just from sort of what people think in the community, is that we're just dumping our waste into the inlet.
There is that. I've heard that myth, but
It
sure.
sounds like we're separating inorganic stuff, going to the landfill.
Yep.
We're burning whatever the euphemism
Biosolids,
is
yep.
for poop, and then we're only putting out liquid that's been
right.
treated. So
No, it is treated. It's disinfected.
or that has been treated. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. So why is that a waiver? I mean, that sounds like a normal system that you would do. So why is it inferior to the non-waiver? And
Yep, good question. So this leads back to the previous presentation, which if you don't have it, I'll give it to you because it answers a lot of these questions, but I'll try to summarize it pretty quick. I'm going to say remember for others, but for us, not, you may not have been there. The distinction between primary and treatment on the waiver, if you will, is for two parameters, BOD and TSS. BOD is biochemical oxygen demand. TSS is total suspended solids. All their parameters have to be met by the Clean Water Act, which is philosophical goals to protect the nation's physical, chemical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, promote fish, shellfish, propagation of wildlife, and recreation. Those are the philosophical goals. The way Congress set that up was said, okay, to meet those goals, all these wastewater plants have to have a permit for secondary treatment, which made sense because the Great Lakes were dying, the Cuyahoga River was on fire. On certain environments you discharge, those two parameters are the main ingredients that can kill a marine environment. You still have to make state water quality standards. But there's certain marine environments where you have good mixing, assimilation, and you're just not having an impact on the environment because, there's just very little impact that BOD and TSS has on a marine environment with good mixing, and which is what we have. And we're dropping the bucket or dropping the pool with those parameters. So BOD, what the really impact it does is it consumes the dissolved oxygen. And the dissolved oxygen in cooking, even in our mixing zone and in our discharge, is almost 10 milligrams per liter, which is what the saturation point is for water, which is what you need for all kinds of aquatic wildlife that rely on dissolved oxygen. So there's no impact on our BOD to the dissolved oxygen. That's why the Congress allowed that. And this is all back in 77. TSS, total suspended solids, it comes out with the settling process. And they set those requirements, 85% removal versus 30% removal. And on TSS, our water is cleaner from a TSS perspective than the ocean we discharge to. I mean, cooking that's milky, our water is cleaner than cooking that from a TSS perspective, and we get really good removal. And the BOD doesn't impact. So remember, I guess that's the big point. Two parameters that distinguish between primary and secondary. So you get a waiver on those two parameters. Instead of having 85% removal requirements, you only have to have 30% removal requirements. We exceed 30%, so we meet the primary standards. We're almost at secondary on one of those parameters.
Ms. Altel.
So is it fair to say when constituents are asking, especially as we look at infrastructure dollars coming into the community, that we need secondary and tertiary treatment for our water, that we're already meeting the secondary standards even under the waiver? And I guess that's the question, because partly it's the perception.
Yep.
And what I heard is we're either there or we're really close to it with the waiver. And that otherwise it's a huge investment to even consider moving forward, and we wouldn't get considerable gains.
That's how I'd phrase it instead. As far as almost being secondary, you could argue that for one of the parameters, not the other. But at the end of the day, you nailed it in my mind. There's no environmental benefit, but there's a huge financial cost. So why do it? I mean, you could if people really want to do it, but there's a cost with no benefit.
A lot of cost.
Now that being said, the permit process makes us go through the environmental review to make sure the biggest hurdle or things that changed was the ESA with the beluga whales. It's the burden of proof's on us to prove we're not hurting them. We've done that, but it hasn't gone through the permitting process yet.
Okay.
So I'll just ask a question, similar topic. Many years ago, a friend who worked for DEC, and she suggested that EPA had minimum and maximum standards for some of these materials and that we didn't meet the minimum standards. Is that still generally true for some of these materials?
What materials are we?
Outflow, stuff that's going into the inlet.
Oh, that's not true. We have to meet state water quality standards for all the other pollutants too.
Not meet, like, it's kind of a nuanced point. Right, we're below the minimum threshold of what was being put out. She suggested many years ago that they were actually thinking they had to add material to the effluent going out to the inlet.
Without more information, I'd say that's not true. I don't know. I'm not sure what that's referring to enough. So point being is we exceed our primary standards. We don't meet secondary, but we don't need to because of the permits in place for that reason, because it's just not necessary. There's not a discernible environmental benefit. Okay. But in order to go through that, there's a long permitting process. It's complex. And so that needs to get approved at this meeting. It went through the competitive process, and we really need, and again, it's 15 years past renewal. Again, we got an administrative extension, but when EPA, and that's the other distinguishing factor on this, EPA or DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, has primacy in the state of Alaska for all permits except 301H permits because they're that important and they've got a lot of public perception associated with them. So EPA retains primacy. EPA doesn't always act, but when they do, we got to move. So we're there. The other thing on there in the star and the bullet, I apologize. As part of our annual permit, or as part of our permitting process, we do have to do annual monitoring out in the inlet to ensure that we aren't harming the environment. And that's been done with kinetics monitoring. We're now on Amendment 17. And that seems like a high number, which it is, but that's been through the assembly several times. And what that is when we first got the permit renewed in 2000, we did an RFP to have an environmental consultant go out and do all the annual monitoring, and that's Kinetics. It was a 5-year contract because it's a 5-year permit with 1-year extensions allowed on it. And no one knew it would be 17 years, but it's been 17 years. You want to have the same environmental compliance person doing this year after year. So what we'll do is once this permit is renewed and whatever form is, we'll do an RFP for a new consultant for that to open it up for competitive bid. So that is also on the agenda as well. It's separate, but they're both tied to the 301H. All right. So scope of work.
Do you by chance have the item numbers?
I don't think they're done yet. They're going through on-base right now because there's fund certificate, all the normal processes are going through right now.
Okay, you think they'll be done and in by tomorrow at noon?
I'd have to ask Amy, and she's not here that I see. So it's going, all I know is there are on-base numbers on there right now. So it is actively going through, but there's a process. It'll probably be an agenda or laid on the table at a bare minimum. Okay, I would love not to. I'd prefer to get it through the agenda.
If it's must pass, you really need to get it to us in advance. So maybe let them know that.
I will. Okay. Well, you heard that. Okay, so the scope of work, honestly, I'll go through there fairly quick, but bottom line is it's a permit integrator. There's a lot of work involved. I've bulleted them all here, but really what I'll probably do is go to the next slide instead because it shows you the complex process that's going to do this. There's 2 processes here. One's the renewal process that EPA follows, and this is just a high-level overview. Information over the last 15 or, well, in this case, 17 years, coordination with ESA and consultation with outside federal stakeholders like National Marine Fisheries, 401 certifications, a DEC process, public notices, permit issuance, and then so on and so forth. And to do all this, there's a lot of work involved. Meetings, coordinating with the stakeholders and the regulators, developing plans, actually doing the physical work in the inlet. So it's a long and expensive process that's going to take some time. And we don't dictate the schedule, the EPA does. And we've known that they're going to start us, but they have never ever given us a firm date when, other than they had told us September 2022. So we've teed this up to be ready for this. But now they're saying we are going to start pretty much now. And we're meeting with them, like I said, next month. And so we need to get this under contract. Next slide.
Mark,
Yes.
is there any public input for that process? I see public notices there, but will there be public hearing?
Yeah.
Comments?
Well, there will be public notice through the EPA. It's a required federal process. But as far as us doing public outreach to address the questions you guys just brought up, guys and gals, is that, that people believe that there's some sort of wild streams going in the ocean by us. And that's not the case. We need to educate the community too. And that is part of the scope of services with Jacobs too, how to get that message out appropriately so people understand what's going on really.
So I think I would suggest, they have their process for doing public outreach. Jacobs does, which can be really great. Sometimes can be not. But we might want to have some formal meeting that's hosted by
Sure, public meetings and stuff. Yeah. Yep.
On top of them doing outreach to councils and other projects.
Yeah. No, good point. It may be in that scope of work, but if not, we'll make sure we have that.
Yeah, thanks. Just at least an opportunity. Otherwise, people will think we skipped
the
process.
Okay, so next slide then. Jacobs is, well, back in the day, it was not Jacobs, it was CH Tilham Hill, but that's now Jacobs. They've done work with us on the 301H permits in the past. In 2005, they actually helped us get the permit in place. They've done a lot of work at Asplin. So bottom line, we selected them based on the competitive process, based on a lot of these criteria here. To go on the next slide. And then obviously what I've already said, it's imminent. They're acting on us right now. They actually, interestingly enough, have given, our understanding is they're going to have draft permits for some of the Southeast Alaska communities and by the fall, which is what time they're going to pivot to us. But we need to meet with them in advance we have this summer field work we got to get started on to make sure we need to meet with them to understand the requirements of the field work, what they're going to expect to meet some of the data gaps that are out there. And so hence why this is really time sensitive in my mind. I mean, it just is time sensitive. And then go to the next slide, which is, what happens if we don't do this? Secondary treatment is going to be very expensive in the $1 billion plus range, which alone, just by that, it also increased O&M direct costs by almost $4.5 million a year. And that doesn't even include the MUSE expense, which would be another $15 to $20 million a year. So there's a huge expense of this. And there are no known federal programs or direct grant participation. Yes, there's earmarks being put out in place now and so on, but we've stayed away from that simply because it's not necessary. And if something through the permitting process shows that, secondary will actually provide benefit, which there's no data that suggests it now, and I just don't see it as being there, then at that point in time, we'd work with them on a compliance program, which is usually 20 years or so, and they'd allow us to seek grants at that point in time. But it's premature. I don't want to send the message to EP and the regulators that our wastewater is not clean and meeting compliance, because it is, and it protects the environment. That's our mission statement. We want to do that. If there's something on our wastewater that's causing problems for the Belugas, we want to know that, because we want to find out first so we can take care of that, because that's important to us. There's just really not money available right now at this magnitude. Go to the next slide.
Mark, before you do that, can you
Yeah.
go back to the previous slide?
Which one?
Just that one. At the bottom, it mentions 401 certification. What is that? Because we're
Yeah.
talking about 301
Yeah.
age variance,
Sorry.
and then we switched to that. I don't understand what that is.
So 401 certification, it was on that slide that showed the blue things in the process.
Right.
401, that's the state's role, ADEC. They have to certify state water quality standards. In other words, that when we discharge, we're meeting state water quality standards for all the other pollutants, primary pollutants, such as metals, benzene, toluene, xylene, which are gas and diesel range organics, nutrients, so on and so forth. The state has its own requirements to protect its water bodies, and they have to certify to the EPA that yes, this discharger is meeting state water quality standards. So yes, we allow it. That's a checkbox, but it's a lengthy process. Honestly, that's the first process we have to start now, and that's involves a lot of field work.
Okay, so that's a state process.
It is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I know 401, 301, a lot of numbers and
Just trying to
weird
understand.
vernacular.
Thank you.
So going 2 more slides forward, then this one. So what would happen if we had to fully fund, we'll call it 1.2 billion in capital expenses? Obviously, we said that O&M expenses would increase by 4.5, but because of just the payback and the return on the payback to do that, if we had to fully fund it, it would be a 235% rate increase from currently about $54 a month to $180 a month, and that's just for the sewer utility. So there's a huge funding or consequence of that. And even if it was grant funded, you still have to pay for those O&M expenses plus the MUSA. So you'd still see a 35% or so rate increase in sewer if it was fully funded by grant dollars. But if it's not, it's far worse. And I think last slide. I think at the end of the day, our mission statement is to safeguard the public health and environment through clean and water and wastewater services. We want to do that, and it's important to us, and we're going to keep that on. And this permit does allow us to do that during the permitting process. If there's something that's missing or is not being done to suffice that'll come out, and we'll have to tend to that.
Any questions? At this point, I don't see any questions. Why don't we move on to the next update?
So this next topic is switching over to the water utility. And we're going to call it, when she gets it pulled up, I'll go to the second slide, but this is a rate update for the water utility. One of them being the fire service charge, but it's an overall rate change holistically. Okay, if you go to the next slide. Again, this is kind of a little bit of a historical summary. Every year we do a revenue requirement study, which just makes sure we have sufficient revenue to cover our expenses, to provide both capital and operational funding needs. The rate increase that we're living with today in 2020, what year is it? 2022. That goes through a long process, and we did a rate increase. I think we submitted to the Assembly and the RCA late in 2021 for a proposed 1.75 and 3.75 for the two utilities, a blended rate increase of about a little less than 3%. So that's interim refundable. The RCA approved that in early January. Interim refundable just means if they go through the long regulatory process, they have 450 days to review this. If they decide later that it's not fair, they can refund customers down the road. So that's what interim refundable means. And so hence the decision is not going to be, they have until February of 2023 to make that decision. That's just kind of where we're at with today's rates. And that's a revenue requirement. That does increase revenue or increase rates. Now go to the next slide. Well, the other thing we did several years ago, we started the process was a rate study, which is separate than a revenue requirement. It's a cost of service study. And that really reallocates rates to make sure that they're equitable and the allocation is cost cause or cost payer. and you're getting charged by the benefit you received. And that's one of the big things on that got changed. And you have to do these. These are not done every year, but we strive to do these every 5 to 10 years. It's you want to have your rate allocation of cost to your different customer classes fair and equitable. And that's so it is required with the RCA, but it's a longer process. So they're not required every year, but they do have to be done every now and then. And one of the things that drove this too is, several years ago when the assembly was asked us to look at the fire service charge, because right now one of the big costs that the fire department has is public fire protection. And the norm has been over the years to have municipalities cover fire protection because fire protection is a municipal requirement. But a lot of utilities and what we looked at through this is that there is a portion of that should be paid for by the customers that receive the most benefits, which is the water customers. So this was looked at and it was changed. And we went through the assembly. I think we submitted this, it may have been, when did I say it on there?
2018, I think.
Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, it's a long process. You have to have the right financial years and so on. But bottom line is the RCA took again, you had to go through the regulatory process, which was probably a year and a half ago when we submitted this to the RCA. They just approved it recently. So those changes are in effect immediately, but we're not rolling them out until the first portion of time we'll see these changes will be on the May bills starting in May. So what you're going to see on there is, so what we did is, and I'm going to go to the next slide because where's my, well, first I'll give a history, I guess. Then because really Chris has already showed me some numbers and emails he's seen from customers. So I'll get to this pretty quick, but just a little bit of a history and why the fire protection rate has been both controversial and why it took us today to get where we're at. Prior to 76, the water utility customers did pay the full cost of fire protection. But in 76, there was a split. Where the MOA fire department paid a portion, then AU customers paid a portion. But in 80, commercial customers filed a lawsuit over the fire protection charge. So then it was moved all over to the municipality, meaning the fire department in that time frame. And then just 95, it went from, with escalation of costs and stuff, it just went from under $1 million to a couple million. And then it's okay. So in 2002 is when it got interesting. 2002, we did a rate study that did propose to remove the fire department charge altogether and put it all to AWU customers. But in 2002, the assembly rejected it at the time. They said they didn't like it, so we never submitted it to the RCA. In 2006, we did another rate study and they confirmed the costs are appropriate. But that's the last time we had a cost of service study that looked at this. So hence the time when we did this in 2018, it was timely, beyond timely in some respects. And so we went through the process with this assembly and the administration, and we looked at it and we split it. One of the things that was challenging those earlier things, it was one entity was going to be forced to pay all of it versus another. And this time we kind of split the costs in some respects, and it was fair and equitable. And that's what we're living with today. The fire departments, let's go to the next slide.
Before we move on,
Yeah.
for folks, just a refresher, what was happening was that taxpayers were paying for the cost of fire hydrant service, and there are huge swaths of the municipality that don't have fire hydrants. And so the idea was to split the cost equitably between the taxpayer and the ratepayer. So there's a taxpayer cost that's generalized for fire service, but then there's a higher rate for ratepayers because we have the benefit of a fire hydrant within 1,000 feet of our home. And so that was kind of the impetus for this conversation to begin. It wasn't black and white and it took a long time, but the outcome was a split that is part in and part out, and I think a very thoughtful compromise. And you may hear some gripes from folks because it is a small increase in a monthly bill.
Yeah. So from a rate making perspective on public fire protection charges, there's two costs associated with public fire protection: direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs are just what Chris alluded to, public fire hydrants, and that's just direct costs related to ongoing operation and maintenance of fire hydrants. Those are direct costs. Then there's the other cost, which is much larger, which is also a much larger cost, which is the indirect cost, and that's really making sure our mains and all our facilities are oversized to accommodate fire flows. So, for domestic water, you could get by with a 2-inch water main, but our mains are 8 inches sized because they have to be sized to apply for water flows, which is several thousand gallons a minute in areas. Likewise, when we design water storage tanks, we have a lot of storage in there for water protection needs. That is not necessary for domestic water, but it is for fire. So hence, even on the day when we have peak water demands by residential customers, there also has to be enough water for fire flow. So essentially our facilities are upsized to accommodate that. And that cost is borne as known as an indirect cost. So currently, in what's been going on since I think we said 1980, AFDA, the fire department's budget has covered 100% of both the direct and indirect cost. And now through the rate study, what we did is AFD is going to still cover 100% of the fire hydrant direct costs, but only 56% of the indirect costs, and the 44% of those indirect costs are going to be borne by the residential customers that receive benefit. In other words, so the way they did that is based on your line size, your service. You know, a 1-inch service is going to pay the least amount because they receive the least benefit, versus like a commercial building with a 6 or 8-inch fire line, they're going to pay a larger portion of that fire cost. And fire department has the largest lines, like 8-inch, 6 or 8-inch for fire hydrant legs. That's why they're paying a portion of that indirect cost. That was kind of the philosophy behind it. It went through the rigorous evaluation with rate experts, and that's what we came up with. So the changes are the new fees that customers are going to see on their bills starting in May. And by the way, the May bills will only be prorated for a portion of the month. In June will be the full bear cost. It's not going to be much different. But bottom line is residential customers will see an increase, a new protection of $1.43 a month. And it ranges and other fees for the larger the services commercials, the larger they'll pay on a monthly basis. And then overall, I think the next slide then has a little further
Hold on
breakdown
a
of.
sec, Mark.
Go ahead.
Ms. Alatel.
Yeah. So has pre-warning gone out to customers that this
Yeah,
is coming?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And they've seen it on the bill statements on the last slide will show this actually too. We put out notices on Facebook, I think Twitter too. I don't have, and other places along with on our website mailings and other places and our bill mailings. Go ahead in the next slide, because that'll give
And
you.
I can attest from a very hot email today that members of the public have in fact seen this information.
So the first one, these are impacts to the most of our customers are either unmetered residential, single family residential, commercial metered, and then of course the Anchorage Fire Department. So those are our biggest customer classes, and who's going to see this. So the one of the top box or table you'll see, the current rate for customers, they pay about $57 a month for overall water billing. It's going to go up to $58 a month because of the fire service charge, which is shown on there. So they're going to see about a 2.5% rate increase. It's not any additional revenue collected, it's just a shift in cost. So I'll go to the bottom line. For instance, fire department, they're going to save $1 million and about $1.2 million per year, and that $1.2 million has to get shifted to the other customers. That's what's going on. So AFD pays about $450 a month now. They're going to go down to $350 a month. So they're saving about $100,000 a month or $1.2 million in a year. And then the metered rates, because they have larger sizes, their monthly rate for the fire protection charge will go to about $11.50 a month. But other areas are out. The reason why, and Chris caught this earlier, is there's other changes when they see their bill, there's services they have to pay for. Some of them are going up and some of them are going down. Hence the parenthetic numbers are decreases, and the ones that are not in parentheses are increases.
Mark, never mind.
And then
I just would note that there was some pretty lively chatter on that reduction there. And
Yeah.
it's going to be a subject of conversation later, I'm sure. So you're saying this goes into effect in May?
Technically April 30th, which
Right,
is essentially
so-
May 1st. So the first round of bills, we bill in cycles, and the first round of cycles will come out probably May 8th, and they'll see a portion of that.
So that's like 2/3 of a year. 2/3 of 1.2 would be $8 million. So it's roughly $1 million a month or $100,000 a month of savings
to the fire
to
department.
the fire
Yeah.
department. Thank you very much.
And then if there's further questions on our website, we do have some information there. And
Ms. Quinn Davidson has a quick question.
Sorry, Mark. Just looking at the last slide here. So I think that my bill's like $99 a month or 110. Is that
110.
because that includes sewer and this is just water?
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
There's remember, two separate economically regulated utilities, one water, one sewer. We're just talking water here.
Got it. So it's $1 more, $1.39 on average.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
And if we opt for the secondary cleaning, it'll be like $250 a month.
Well, the combined will be high. Yeah.
By the way, back when Chris was talking about the minimum, I think you guys were saying the same thing. He was saying it like we didn't meet some bad threshold was what he meant, not
Okay.
that we weren't meeting minimum standards.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
No, that was my point was we weren't even in a measurement. If you had to measure between 5 and 10 parts per million, we weren't even hitting 5.
I got you. Okay.
Right. That's what I meant by my comments. And that's just a random number, but yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification. Go ahead, Mark.
It's a trick question.
We have to move on pretty soon. We got a bunch of other items and not a lot of time.
Done? I am.
Thank you, Mr. Corstino. Any last questions before we move on to the next item? Okay, next we're going to be talking about port infrastructure grant. Steve, come on up. Yeah.
6 years.
Yeah. That I just kept it going because it's fairness and equity. You know, it's just fair. She didn't have anything to do with it. She was gone at the state when I pushed on this. She and I started it, but this was when she was in that interim space, and I just pushed. And now we have a little margin for the fire department. Mr. Ruffo, you have the floor.
Well, this was a very simple question, so I may have over-prepared. And if that's the case, just speed me along. Otherwise, I thought I would take advantage. Desiree, bring the next slide up, please. Yeah. Give you a little bit of an overview on all things federal grants and what the process looks like, what it is, how ports fit into not only IAJA, but the way federal grants for infrastructure are done nationwide and have been for the last 10 plus years, to give you a little bit of an appreciation for that. And then I'll give you the process on how we go about applying and managing once we've gotten an award. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide was prepared by the port industry's advocacy group in Washington, D.C., the American Association of Port Authorities. And on this one page is the sum total of all the opportunities in the world of federal grants, IAJA and not IAJA, that ports can use to get grant money. Now, it is a relative drop in the bucket compared to what's out there for roads and what's out there for rail and for air, and I would argue even bike paths. There's not much of a federal DOT advocacy for ports. And as a consequence of that, this is what we've got to play with. And the biggest change over the course of the last decade and a half was the addition of the Port Infrastructure Development Program, which is really for ports only. And not only for port infrastructure as it ties into other modes of transportation, but for dock-related port work. There has never been a federal grant program that ports could go to where you could ask for money to do anything to repair, replace, modify, increase the size of a marine terminal facility. This is the first time when we've been able to do that. And so this kind of gives you the context in which ports can work to apply for grants. And next slide. Okay. So what are we doing? Well, we're going to take advantage this year of make an application for PIDP for $30 million. Infra-Mega, which is a new twist on the infra program for $40 million. And then what we have always had what's called the Port Security Grant Program. That one is managed by FEMA. And we've applied for that successfully for many years. The notice of funding opportunity isn't out yet. We've received in the 15 years that I've been down at the port over $9 million through this program for fencing and surveillance cameras and other kinds of security-related equipment. And we don't anticipate not being successful again this year. In fact, we are about to start spending the $1.5 million grant that we received prior year. But where we're focusing this year is on the North Extension Stabilization, the NES. That part of the north end that was part of the old failed expansion program that needs to be removed before we can actually start construction of the cargo docks. So it's a big enough program with over $250 million worth of costs associated with it, where we could cut it up and go after individual pieces, parts of it on different grant applications and not have to go through the criticism of applying for the same thing multiple times.
Steve, we have a question.
Also new this year.
Steve, one quick question from Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thank
Oh,
you,
I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Constant. No problem. So just so I understand, the $40 million that you're asking for, that is through, what is it, congressionally directed spending, the new word for earmarks. Are you making a request through Senator Murkowski's office
Yes.
for $40 million?
Yes.
Excellent. Chris
You
and I.
got out in front of me, but okay, I'll answer it now.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, it's listed here. So,
Yes.
yeah, so Chris and I visited with Senator Murkowski about a month ago, and she encouraged us, she and her staff, which we've continued to be in touch with, encouraged us to apply for CDS
Yes.
for things we thought homelessness. For instance, the Valley
Mhm.
got a $20-some million structure for homelessness. We could apply for the same sort of thing, and port. So we've been trying to collaborate with the administration. It's been a little difficult. They haven't told us which things they're applying for. So it's good for us to know that we're so glad you're doing this. And I think that Senator Murkowski's office will probably want to know that this assembly supports this. So when it's appropriate, we'd love to do a resolution for you saying that we support this ask.
Well,
So,
I appreciate that. And I think now's the time.
okay,
Yeah,
so
because we're going to get that, we're about done writing it and are going to be, submitting it, I think, by the end of the week. Yeah. Yeah.
great.
So we're there.
If you could send us more information about what the ask is, the exact amount, why, blah, blah, what will be used for, I bet that these two, as the chairs of
I
this
would
committee, would.
frame it a little bit differently. If you would have your staff draft up a resolution for the assembly to move. We have a meeting on Tuesday.
Okay.
Yeah. Get it in a nice draft format that we can work with. So
Yeah, that's
we
a good
have-
idea.
Happy
You guys
to.
can. Thank you, Steve.
All right, you bet. Yeah, and that's new this year. And so we're going to take advantage of that. And so the battlefield has been prepped for this earmark application. Personal feeling is I kind of hope this is here to stay.
The France.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking at the chart here with the different amounts, and just so I understand clearly too, for the infrastructure bill, I had heard that for ports and waterways, there was 17 billion available nationwide over 5 years, and then maybe with a couple smaller other kinds of buckets, project-based.
Mhm.
And so on here, how much are we, is that I'm sorry, I guess I'm looking down
Yeah, which
below
line?
40
are we-
million is what is under infra mega? Is that what
That
we're
is-
applying for?
Yeah, this is through the FY22 only cut.
Okay,
So it's 3.4 plus 2.2 plus, well, you don't go back to 21. That's just the history. But 3.4 and 2.2, that is what is available this year for ports nationwide under the RAISE Infra Mega program to
Okay.
pick from. And, there is far and away more demand and need than there is that money in a pot.
okay, I guess, yeah, I was just curious if the 17 billion over 5 years, is what we're looking at, but.
Yeah, and this is how what we don't know is how they're going to take the next 4 years and divvy it up.
Right,
Yeah, this is what we know based on the fact that this is the first year, how they've carved it up.
got it. Thank you. And thank you for being so on top of this.
Well-
Appreciate it.
All right, Steve, go ahead.
Well, it's either this or pick your pockets. Yeah. Okay, so here's how we go about it here at the port. The port staff obviously plays in the game. We have a grant writing contractor, Moffitt Nickel. They've been on board with us for over 2 years now, so they have done this many times for many different customers. And the biggest challenge when you're putting a grant application together is not necessarily telling the story and identifying the amount of the need. It's the benefit cost analysis that you need to put in place to defend how the government is going to get their money's worth when they give you something. And these guys are just absolute experts at doing that. We work with Jacobs Engineering, who you all know, because there's where the gory detail comes when it comes to putting the grant package together. And new to the team, Blank Rome, the municipality's lobbyists in DC, who can reach out and give us some of that, inside baseball information on what the marketplace is interested in seeing and how things ought to be worded. Because believe it or not, from year to year, how you talk about what it is you want to apply for matters in the vernacular that everybody's using in DC. So you don't get that exposure without a little bit of help. And they've been excellent at doing that. 3 rules of thumb we always use when we apply for grants. We don't compete against ourselves. So we pick a category, put 1 grant application in. This is not a shotgun operation. This is a sniper rifle operation. And we only target grants where we know the probability of success is high because we can tell a good story that's defendable and we have all the facts. Yeah. Because if you submit a grant before it's ripe, you've blown any opportunity to go back and try again. We've been burned this way a couple of times where we thought we were close enough to take the risk. But once you've submitted a grant for a particular thing and you fail and you go back the next year, there's no interest in giving you a do-over. So we've learned out the hard way and certainly don't want to repeat that mistake. And we also confer with the grant people and with our friends at Jacobs, because we have to have a defendable position. And not only do we have to have a defendable position to make a viable benefit cost analysis, but believe it or not, your work breakdown structure and how you define what you're going to use the money for matters. Because if you submit a grant and you've broken up the pieces parts one way and the bills start coming in after a grant award and they don't match up, you're going to go through months and months and months of delay before you even see a dime of that which you've been awarded. It's just the way the game is played.
Ms. Zolotov's question.
Yes.
So how do we utilize all this work that you and your team are doing to help frame the answer to the question of what's the plan of finance for the port modernization project? Because as we've been advocating for the port in Juneau in particular, it's, well, what are you doing to seek other funding sources? And
Yeah.
so I don't know if it's simply like pointing like, hey, we're looking at these opportunities as they're available and we can strategically avail ourselves of them, or what the right message to convey is.
Sure.
You're doing a lot.
Yeah, we are. And you're giving me an opportunity to share my frustration as many times as I've sat in front of the Senate Finance Committee or the House Finance Committee and been asked, what's your plan of finance? And answered the question. For some reason, we can't figure out what the right answer is. I don't know why, because for me, it's fairly simple. We look for federal grant opportunities. We used to look for earmarks. Maybe we can start saying that again, but there are federal grant opportunities. There are state grant opportunities. And then there's the banking industry. And we strive and we try to get as much free money, for lack of a better term, as we possibly can to offset what we'd have to go to a bank to borrow to cross the finish line. And this port's no different than any other port nationwide. The difference between us and roads and rail and all of that is they have the formula money, and the formula money is going to come down in a particular year, and in advance when that is. So you can put your structure in place to cover the difference between, or to get your local match, because all you need to come up with is a local match. We have to come up with a local match not only for these grants, but to get across the finish line. And if the state's not helping, and if the feds can't help, then we go it alone. I mean, that's about the simplest, most fundamental way I can define what the plan of finance is. I don't understand why that is so hard to understand.
So, Steve,
for the life of me,
I
I
can
can't.
give you a clue, I think. From what I've heard, what I am understanding people are wanting is within a range, because there's no way to get it exact because it's such a large scale project, a cost, what you're going to build, and then a spreadsheet of what your target revenues are. And so, and what Senator Sullivan asked for was an actual book, like a published book, which is super weird and anti or counterintuitive because it's always changing.
Yeah.
But some kind of a simple, well-published, good-looking document with pictures that says this is the cost, these are the plans within range, and here's how we're going to fund it. That's what I've heard them ask for very specifically.
Yeah, and that kind of thing has gotten us in trouble before.
I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm
and
absolutely
which
sure.
is why there's a little bit of trepidation on doing so, because once you put numbers on a piece of paper, those are the numbers.
That's what the
And if
legislature
you go back in 2 or 3 years and the numbers are different, now you got to spend the first 30 minutes of the conversation explaining why the numbers changed, when you knew darn well the ones you gave in the first place were going to be shy of what the actual numbers were really going to be.
Right. And so
You know,
coming up with the language that frames it properly that way could be helpful. But I think you literally just expressed the reason why folks in legislative positions and higher governing bodies are saying, where's the plan of finance? Because if the argument is if we put it in writing, then we're held accountable to it. They're like, yeah, that's
Yeah,
what we
exactly,
want.
exactly.
And so somewhere between, we have an idea that we're going to fund it by grants and then by revenues, tariffs with the bank. They just want to know what. So
Yeah. I mean, we know generally the categories that of places we would go to get the dollars, but the numbers that you can't guarantee the numbers you're ever going to get. And we can apply for, in this case, we'll apply for $110,000 worth of grant money. We put that in the plan of finance and get zero. Well, that number that you would have gone to the bank for just went up by $110,000.
Yeah.
So how do you know? And now you're accused of screwing it up.
And interest rates are changing. The finance markets are in
And the
very
time
weird
value of
states
money
and
changes
everything.
every year. And the cost of
Understand.
goods changes
But that-
every year.
That answers the question though of what they're looking for is something concrete that they can say, what are you selling me?
Yeah.
That's what they're asking for.
No.
Okay. So I
We
don't
can
know
go to the
how
next
much more
slide.
we have. Last slide. We have also one last presentation and not much time to get there.
And this is just a rundown on the process. You know, once the grant gets submitted, it's got to get to the point where it's sitting on the Secretary of Transportation's desk. You know, you got to make sure that the package is put together right. You've included everything that they said the requirements for the contents would be. They actually do check that to make sure you've filled all the squares, and a little bit of a quality call, but they don't make we like these guys, we don't like this guy. At some point, they're going to give them to the secretary if it passes muster, and it sits on his desk, and then the phone calls to the delegations begin, and they have to figure out who they're going to throw their weight behind, and who is going to have to wait another year, and that's where we spend time making sure that the delegation staffers know that we've got a grant submitted, and we will occasionally share a copy of it with them so they at least know what it is we've applied for. So when the phone calls start coming, or when it comes time to start nudging, they have the backstory to be able to do it with. Yeah. And if we get an award, then the whole grants management process begins, to include the municipality's grants management office. Yeah, because everything will clear through them when we submit for reimbursements and the like. So we all have to be on the same page. And we have to get on the same page within our case here. Our lead DOT agency is going to be MARAD. So we've got to be able to establish those relationships with the MARAD grant managers so that they understand what it is we're submitting to them for reimbursement, and it passes the way they want to see it, their accounting process for the way they want to see it. And that, you would think that was another intuitive process, but it can be tremendously painful. And you've got to start with the application that you've submitted correctly, so you can minimize the amount of rework you got to do to start getting yourself reimbursed in the end. Just like that. Next slide, please, Desiree. Yeah, so, I would say we've been doing this for a lot of years. There's never been this much money to be had before. So what we're hoping we're going to see after this year is how the feds are going to behave when it comes to this grant money. Are they going to give bigger awards to about the same number of people, or are they going to take advantage of having more money and give the regular size awards to a larger audience. We've asked, nobody's answered. So what they release as an awards list will kind of give us the indication of when we do this again next year, ask for a little bit more or stay in that sweet spot because you hit it right. So, more to come on that. And and just appreciate that. I wish we were Federal Highways. I wish we were the FAA, but we're not. So those pots are huge, and ports. The only option ports have is to apply for grants. That's it. And that's what we're going to do. And pick a winner. Set yourself up for success. Rolling the dice is going to bite you in this game here. If you can make a defendable case for a grant application, make that one this time and wait for next year to do it again on the next one that you can make a good case for.
Mr. France?
Thank you, Steve. Just to be clear, aside from the plan of finance, do you have all the resources you need to be competitive in this process?
I think we do. It's a really good team. And if I had to sit on a 2-hour conference call on how we're going to apply for infra while I'm sitting in Reagan Airport with people from all over the country who are telling me how wrong I am, that's great. That's as it should be. And we have a very strong team to do this. I just hope it'll bear some fruit.
Great.
It's a tough
Thank you.
competitive environment.
I think you know that the Assembly is highly supportive of your efforts, so thank you.
And that makes this so much easier. It really does. We
All right.
appreciate it.
So no objection, we'll extend the meeting for about 5 more minutes. I know that's going to bump into the next meeting, but
don't start till 12:10.
right. So, Mr. Ames. This is a presentation on recommendation of award for the new administration building to be built on the docks. So, Mr. Ames, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Constant. It's good to be here. I'll try to keep this quick. I understand the time crunch. Go ahead to the next slide, Desiree. Really just want to update you on an item that should be on the Assembly addendum agenda for next week, the recommendation for award of the administration building. For those of you that are familiar with the phase 2, I think we've gone through this in previous meetings. The administration building is currently on Terminal 1 on the dock over the water. It needs to be moved both to build a safer working space and also to enable us to demolish existing Terminal 1 and continue on with phase 2. Next slide, please. We have just completed the design build selection process with the municipality. RFPs were requested or initially solicited back in January. The roughly 2-month process led to about 8 proposals, which were all solid proposals. We narrowed it down to 3 shortlisted competitors that we interviewed, and now we're recommending award to STG Pacific for a contract value of $8.27 million. Normal contingency amount, roughly 10%, 827,000, brings us to a total contract amount of about 9.1 million. And that's about 900,000 under the 10 million budget for the project. We were very pleased with the proposals we received, and we were also very pleased, especially with STG Pacific's proposal and the thought that they went into, or the thought that they put into the planning of the foundations of the building that seemed to foresee potential concerns in advance. So we were very pleased with their approach to the project. Construction completion, if awarded now, would be October of 2023 as proposed. We would recommend the contract term go through December 2023 to avoid any delays.
Mr. Ames, Mr. Ames,
sorry.
Ms. Quinn Davidson has a question.
Hi there. Okay, so PCT is nearly done finishing up this summer. This is for
correct.
the cargo area.
This is to relocate the administration building so we can begin the cargo
So that's
docks
separate
demolition.
from the cargo docks. It's
Correct.
just, okay.
Correct. It's a
Just sort
first
of a
step.
little piece that we don't hear a lot about because it's not the big ones. Is that
That's
it? Okay,
correct.
got
That's
it.
correct.
Thanks.
Okay. So we recommend award of this. I guess one final note is that the bids that and the proposals that have been put in do have limitations of the validity of their prices. And if we don't award now, we do run the risk of inflation based cost increases in the bids. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So just continuing with a brief update, I've been attending the committee meetings a couple times over the last few months to give you updates on things that were coming before the assembly. Colby Hickle, Steve Rebuffo, and I have discussed it. If it would please the committee, I'm happy to come and give a 5-minute update on the progress of the port project, of the PAMP project, just to keep you up to speed on budgets, schedules, things like that, and not just attend when we have an item on the agenda. Just making that offer. Ms. Quinn Davidson, you mentioned the PCT. Just wanted to let you all know that the PCT equipment is commissioned. It is complete. From a construction perspective, it's ready for barge service. The port is now working with the users to do the dry run testing of the equipment and the first visits to the terminal. So that's good news at the PCT. We also just got our dredging permit this morning to continue on with dredging next week and begin the season with a lot of momentum. One other item that should be on the assembly agenda is on Tuesday is a recommended change order to Cowie Engineering for PCT design changes for about $286,000 of their $4.7 million contract. It's a small percentage increase, about 6%, but it does cover all of the design changes anticipated through the 2022 construction season. And then last, I'll just note that NES1, the design build RFP, that'll be another part of phase 2. That's the North Extension Stabilization. We are preparing the design build RFP now, and that should be issued by the end of May. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Question for Steve. Steve, when is the opening of the petroleum cement terminal celebration?
I don't know. I have to, I'll have to confer with Colby and the mayor to find out when they want to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Make sure that the assembly is included.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Ms. LaFrance.
I'm sorry?
Ms. LaFrance had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Quinn Davidson's question actually made me look at the project list under the PAMP, and I'm just curious where the administration building fits.
Okay. Do you have sorry, Ms. LaFrance, do you have a project list that you're referring to?
So the PCT, the North Extension Stabilization Step 1, Cargo Dock Terminal 1, Cargo Dock Terminal 2, Petroleum Terminal, T3 Demo, and NES2.
On that particular list, I didn't generate those slides, but the admin building is a small portion of phase 2.
Cargo Dock Terminal 1?
It could be considered part of that because it is removed off of existing Terminal 1 before existing Terminal 1 can be demolished and replaced with Terminal 1. But it sounds like that may not be a complete list.
Okay, thanks.
This isn't a PowerPoint presentation we have before us. Desiree, did you get this one?
I have it and it's posted online. Just in different copies.
Great. Would you just email it to members as well?
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay.
Any other questions? Mr. Dunbar?
Since we have you here, Steve, we know that the mayor, and with the support of the assembly and our resolution, has asked for $600 million from the state. Just briefly, and I apologize, I left for about 5 minutes to take a call, so maybe you already addressed this, but where are we on that? Is it in any of the existing capital budgets at the state? Does it look like it's going to become?
And I have not been involved in any of that. I know
Okay.
David might have a better chance at answering it than I do. We've sort of been out of the planning for what's going on down in Juneau.
Okay.
Ms. Quinn Davidson, then we're out of time. We have to quickly
Just-
pivot. Go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, when Ms. LaFrance, Mr. Peterson, and Ms. Ross and I were down there, the message we heard from legislators on both sides of the aisle was 600 million is a ridiculous ask and it will never happen. I don't know where we are now, but they were pretty honest about that. So, I mean, we think it'd be great. We would love to get 600 million, but they said we don't have that much money, even in the ARPA funds that we have that we could use. We would be using more money than we had for the entire state. I mean, they were very opinionated about it, which prompted us to say, wow, we need to get down there more and talk with them more because they're not understanding the gravity of the situation. So,
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the information that I received yesterday was the co-chairs of Senate Finance are not on board. They believe that we should pay for this by increasing rates. And so
Right, which is that other bag that Steve was mentioning. So we'll continue doing this work and advocacy, and we are out of time for this. Is there any member of the public that wishes to be heard? Hearing and seeing none, that item is concluded. Thank you, everybody, for your participation today. I think that meets the end of our agenda. We'll do the updates later on the stormwater utility, legislative priorities, and the budget. And with that, we are adjourned.